This news from the Eurozone comes on the heels of last week's assessment from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that the global economic recovery remains sluggish. The OECD also found that key developed economies are getting stronger. I spoke to Nariman Behravesh, author of Spin-Free Economics. He's also chief economist at IHS Global Insight. I asked him if this squares with his own analysis.
Well, in some countries, we're already there. I mean, certainly the UK is doing fairly well. It keeps surprising on the upside. And so we will easily see sort of 1.5% growth this year and maybe 2% growth next year. So I think we're in good shape where the UK is concerned. Germany as well, I think, the numbers aren't quite as good as that, but still decent. A lot of the German numbers giving us some pleasant surprises, although it's been a little mixed recently. But once you get into the southern European countries, they're still in recession, and that recession is likely to last through next year. So I would say you put all that together, the EU is growing, not very strongly, but that recovery is not broad-based. It's very narrowly based, and just in a few of the larger countries.
You mentioned the UK. We're seeing some improvement there with unemployment, but Spain just added, I think, 31 people last month. Spain's still having its issues. Greece, of course, as well. They may need another round of bailouts, and yet the Prime Minister calls them an island of stability. Which one is more accurate?
Well, the good news is Greece has made a lot of progress in terms of reducing its fiscal sort of overhang, if you will, the budget problems, and in terms of improving its competitiveness. So Greece has done a lot, but it's still suffering. It's still in a recession. The economy's not doing so well. But in terms of committing to and following through on the promises they made, given the bailouts they got, they've done it. And so in that sense, they deserve more help. There's no question about it. And for a while there was talk about Greece leaving. I think that's gone pretty much, and very few people talking about that. So in that sense, things have stabilized for Greece. The Spanish situation also improving somewhat. It's a much bigger economy. It's a bigger deal for the rest of Europe, obviously. But its problems, obviously, were not as bad as Greece's were, but they're still there. But I would say, again, cautiously optimistic about Spain. Its borrowing costs, for example, have come down quite a lot. Investors seem a little more upbeat about its ability to manage its problems. So I would say both of these countries, Greece and Spain, are making progress.
There's been a lot of talk about tapering, as you well know, and there's been a lot of talk as well about emerging economies and how they might suffer as a result of that. What's your sense about that?
Well, clearly what happened is that a lot of the liquidity that the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and Bank of England and so forth pumped into the economies of these big industrialized economies, they showed up in the emerging world in the sense that there was a lot of capital inflows into the emerging world that for a while pushed up the currencies in places like Brazil and Indonesia and India and so forth, to the extent that there was a lot of talk about currency wars and so forth, if you remember. And then recently, when it looks like the Fed's going to pull back, then all these capital flows into the emerging world come right back out again, and they push down the currencies of these countries. And that's what we've seen is a big flight of capital from the emerging world. So clearly, they're still very vulnerable to what goes on in the developed world in terms of what the Fed's doing and the tapering you're talking about. And also, the potential for the Bank of England and eventually the European Central Bank to start to tighten, to start to taper.
Nariman, we've got probably about 45 seconds. The OECD came out and said last week it looks as though the economy of China is stabilizing. But should there be some concerns about a hard landing, perhaps?
Well, there's always a worry there, but I would say the probability of a hard landing in China is no more than about 25% right now. The recent data do show that not only has it stabilized, but there's a little bit of strength there in terms of industrial production, in terms of exports and so on. So our worries about a hard landing in China are diminishing somewhat.
Nariman Behravesh there.